the spring of 1847, rescuers climbing into the Sierra Nevada found a woman standing over a fire, boiling something in a pot that made grown men turn away and refuse to look inside. What she was cooking was not what they had braced themselves to find. It was worse. The story she told them afterward, calmly, without apparent shame, is the part of this story that never makes it into the textbooks. Most people think they already know this one. Wagon train, mountain snow, desperate settlers eating their dead. That version is true, and it's also nowhere near complete. The real story involves decisions made weeks before anyone saw a single snowflake. A shortcut that wasn't a shortcut. Warnings ignored by men too proud to turn back, and a betrayal inside the group that turned survival into something closer to a competition with rules nobody agreed to and a body count nobody wanted to admit to afterward. 87 people started this journey, only 48 walked out. And what happened to get them there was worse than we were told. The disaster began, as most disasters do, with a decision that sounded reasonable at the time. In the spring of 1846, a group of families departed Springfield, Illinois, bound for California, drawn by pamphlets and letters describing a paradise of fertile land and mild winters. Among them were George Donner, a prosperous farmer in his 60s, and James Reed, a furniture manufacturer traveling with his family in what may have been the most comfortable wagon on the entire journey. A two-story contraption with a stove and spring-cushioned seats that other travelers openly mocked as an indulgence. Neither man had any reason to believe this trip would end differently than the dozens of successful wagon crossings that had come before them. The party's fate changed in July, at a trading post called Fort Bridger in present-day Wyoming, when they encountered a man named Lansford Hastings. Hastings had published a guidebook promoting a new route to California, one he claimed would shave nearly 400 miles off the standard trail. He had never actually taken this route with a wagon train himself. He had ridden it on horseback, alone, and assumed that what worked for one man on a horse would work identically for 87 people and dozens of heavily loaded wagons. The Donner Party trusted him anyway, left the well-worn main trail that thousands of settlers had already proven safe, and turned south into terrain that would cost them weeks they did not have. The Hastings cutoff was not a shortcut. It was a trap disguised as one. The party spent nearly a month hacking a wagon road through the Wasatch Mountains, a stretch that should have taken days, felling trees and clearing boulders by hand while their food supplies quietly dwindled. Then came the Great Salt Lake Desert, 80 miles of cracked earth with no water, where the party's cattle bolted from thirst and scattered into the wasteland, taking with them wagons worth of supplies that were never recovered. By the time they rejoined the main trail near present-day Nevada, the Donner Party had lost nearly a month of time, dozens of oxen, and any margin for error they might have had against the coming winter. They did not know it yet, but the mountains ahead would not forgive the delay. What makes this stretch of the journey so difficult to look back on is how avoidable it was. Other wagon parties this season had heard the same rumors about Hastings' route and chosen to stay on the established trail instead, arriving in California weeks ahead of the Donner Party and well before the mountain passes closed. The people who trusted Hastings were not reckless by nature. They were ordinary families who made one bad bet on a stranger's advice, at exactly the moment in the journey when there was no longer enough time left to recover from being wrong. What almost nobody remembers about this story is that the group was already fracturing before they ever saw snow. In October, somewhere in the Nevada desert, a violent argument broke out between James Reed and a teamster named John Snyder over a stalled wagon blocking the trail. Snyder struck Reed with the butt of his whip. Reed drew a knife and killed him. The party, exhausted and frightened, held an impromptu trial on the spot and banished Reed from the group entirely, sending him ahead alone with almost no provisions, separating a capable, resourceful man from the very people who would need him most in the weeks ahead. Reed survived alone in the wilderness for days by eating insects and roots, eventually made it to California on his own strength, and would later return as one of the men leading rescue parties back into the same mountains for the very people who had voted to exile him. The group that cast him out never fully accounted for what that decision actually cost them. It is one of the quieter ironies of this entire story. The same trial that punished one man for violence ended up removing the single person most likely to have organized an earlier, better provisioned escape once the snow began falling. By late October, the Donner Party had reached the eastern slope of the Sierra Nevada, and here, so close to safety, the mountains delivered the blow that sealed everything. An early snowstorm sealed the mountain pass weeks ahead of schedule, trapping the group at what is now called Donner Lake, with winter supplies meant to last a much shorter journey and a mountain wall between them and California that would not open again until spring. What followed was not one winter of suffering. It was 5 months of it, in snow that reportedly reached 20 feet deep in places, with families huddled in makeshift cabins burning through what little food remained, while they waited for a rescue that had no guaranteed arrival date at all. This is where the story most people know begins to diverge from what actually happened. Popular memory treats the cannibalism at Donner Lake as a single unified act of desperation, starving people making an impossible choice together. The reality was far more fractured and far more disturbing. Different family groups, isolated in separate shelters by the snow, made different choices at different times, and not everyone made them with the same restraint. The most notorious case involved a group known as the Forlorn Hope, 17 men and women who set out on foot in December to cross the mountains and find help. 10 of them died along the way, and the survivors, facing starvation with no other option, resorted to eating the flesh of their own dead companions. One survivor, a hired hand named William Foster, was later accused by several members of the group of something closer to murder than survival, allegedly killing 2 Native American guides who had been sent to help the party not out of self-defense, but specifically to use their bodies as food when the deaths of white members of the group could not supply enough. The 2 men, Luis and Salvador, had walked days out of their way to bring help to strangers. They received none in return. Back at the lake camp, a German immigrant named Louis Kieseberg would become the figure history remembers most harshly, and for reasons that go beyond simple survival. When rescuers finally reached the camp in the spring, they found Kieseberg alone among the dead, having outlasted nearly everyone else in his shelter. What they found him doing, and what he reportedly told them afterward, went well past what starvation alone could explain. Rescuers described finding human remains in his cooking pot, arranged in ways that suggested he had continued long after any conceivable need to. Kieseberg would spend the rest of his life denying the worst of the accusations against him, insisting again and again that he had done only what was strictly necessary to survive. But the accounts from the rescuers who found him, along with the physical evidence they described in the camp, painted a picture that many of them found genuinely impossible to reconcile with simple desperation alone. What almost never gets told alongside the horror is how selectively survival actually worked. Of the 87 people who began this journey, the death toll fell disproportionately on single men traveling without family units, and on the poor and the hired help who had joined wealthier families as laborers. Families with more resources, more wagons, more food reserves at the outset, lost fewer members proportionally than those who had less to begin with. Survival at Donner Lake was not simply a matter of willpower or luck. It tracked, with uncomfortable precision, along the same lines of wealth and social standing that had shaped these people's lives long before they ever left Illinois. The rescue itself came in waves, not as a single dramatic arrival, because no rescue party had the resources to bring everyone out at once. The first relief team reached the lake camp in February 1847, found survivors too weak to walk on their own, and could only carry out a fraction of them, leaving the rest to wait for a second party while their food, already nearly gone, continued to run out. A third relief effort in April found the camp's last survivors, including Kieseberg, and by then, more than 4 months after the snow first sealed the pass, the group's story had already been shaped by choices no rescuer could undo. What makes the Donner Party's story worse than the version most people carry with them is not the cannibalism itself. It is everything that made the cannibalism almost inevitable, and everything that happened around it that history has quietly smoothed over. A guidebook author who never tested his own route. A banishment that removed the group's most capable member at the worst possible moment. Guides who walked into the mountains to save strangers and were killed for their trouble instead. A survival rate that broke down along lines of wealth rather than character. None of that fits comfortably into the story of ordinary people forced into an extraordinary, understandable horror. It is a story about how quickly a group of 87 strangers, bound together only by a shared destination, can turn on each other once the destination stops mattering and only survival remains. The wagon ruts these families cut through the desert are still visible in satellite photographs today, faint scars across land that has barely changed in 170 years. A reminder that the ground itself remembers what the textbooks tend to leave out.